Hello, I'm Kim Benoit, and I want to set a scene for you today. You are a podcast host. Yes, I know, big stretch, but hang with me. You've been talking to your guest for the last half an hour or so, and you're wrapping up your interview. You thank the guest, you do your close, and hit that stop recording button. You take a breath and ask the guest, "Well, what did you think?" Your guest pauses, looks at you, and says, I feel like I just had a conversation with a friend. Wow. If there ever was a mic drop moment in podcast hosting, that was it. That type of moment happens through truly connecting with your guest. Why is connecting so important? It's not all about the compliments, although that is a nice bonus. Have you ever started talking to someone you never met before and felt an instant alignment or connection with them? It's a great feeling that can happen naturally, but more often than not, it takes some time to develop, especially if the conversation is taking place virtually. If you have a weekly podcast, that means you talk to at least 50 people over the course of a year, and having a genuine connection with each and every one of them can be challenging. However, connection is the number one way to create natural conversations that really resonate with both your guests and your listeners. When you truly connect with your guest, the listeners will hear it and feel it. Today, I'm going to help you create that connection by giving you 3 keys that will help you connect with your guests in meaningful ways. The first key to connecting with your guests is preparation. This may seem obvious, but many hosts only skim the surface of this before their interviews. The goal of good preparation is getting to know your guest so that you can provide a great conversation for your listeners. A 30-minute conversation does not give you much time to really get to know someone. So it's important to find ways to accelerate that process. Here's a few ways you can do this through preparing for the interview. First, use the podcast one sheet or pitch as a starting point. These are usually filled with information, including suggested topics, links, and photos. After deciding that, yes, this guest seems like someone I'm aligned with and I'd like to have them on my show, you shouldn't just rely only on that information to create that connection you really need. Dig a little deeper. Go to their website if they have one. The first page I go to is the About page. This page is filled with nuggets of information that help you get to know the guest on a deeper level. There may be a story there that you want to ask more about during your conversation. If they have a blog, make sure you read some of those posts too. Taking note of something that your listeners will want to know more about will help you formulate questions and direct the conversation. And when I say take note, I mean literally take notes. Don't rely on your memory during the interview. And speaking of notes, my second tip for preparing for an interview is taking good notes ahead of time. Write down your notes, questions, and anything else you need to remember neatly. And I cannot stress that enough. Make your notes neat enough so that you can read them as you're recording. I have a notebook that dedicates one page to each guest with their name at the top, along with any pronunciation tips, very important, their title if needed, and any notes that I want to remember. This gives me about a half a page to write down notes during the interview if I need to. If your guest has written a book, read it. Even if your podcast is not focused on promotion, you will learn more about them. If you don't have time to read the whole book, skim a few chapters and pick out a few that align with the episode you're planning. The first time I had the opportunity to do this with a guest, she was so impressed that we were talking about her book and bringing it into the conversation that she even mentioned it in the review. Another guest was really impressed when I actually read a passage out of her book as we were talking because it really resonated with me. Now, both of these women had been on many podcasts before mine, and the fact that they were impressed by this tells me that not too many podcast hosts take the time. So that is definitely a missed opportunity. So try and read those books. And a fun fact, many guests will offer to send you the book for free ahead of the interview. So make sure you take advantage of that. And then, of course, do not forget to leave a review. Reading their book will create that deeper connection because they realize that you took the time to get to know them better. Taking the time to prepare for your guests ahead of time will lead to better conversations for both you and your audience. The second key to connecting with your guests is allowing buffer time before and after the interview. Early in my podcasting journey, I overscheduled myself. I love recording and sharing the stories, but I was creating more stress for myself and my guest because they were waiting months for their episode to air. I'm a little ashamed to admit that I would sometimes record 3 or 4 guests in one day, and it was a hectic process. Eventually, I learned to give myself and my guests the gift of time. Whether you create your calendar online or you go old school with a paper planner, make sure you leave time, 10-15 minutes before and after the interview. This gives you time to get to know the guest a little bit better, go over any last-minute details or questions, and create a more relaxed atmosphere. Use this time to pay attention to your guest's speaking style. Do they speak fast, slow? Do they consider what they say before they say it? You can get a lot of information in just a few minutes, and you never want to go into a conversation feeling rushed. So make sure you take that time. Leaving time after the interview is also important because it gives you a chance to get any feedback and write down any notes you want to remember when you go back to edit the episode. Once in a while, a guest will realize that they forgot to say something important, and then you have some time to go ahead and record it if that should happen. They will appreciate this, which again leads to better connection. Even if you schedule a pre-interview before your recordings with your guest, you should still leave this extra time the day of the interview. And by the way, I only record 2 episodes per week now, quality over quantity. So these first 2 keys I just covered are both related to time, mostly before the interview. And the next tip pertains to the actual interview. The third key to connecting with your podcast guest is something we've been taught at a young age: strong communication skills. Even if you have perfect communication skills, things may be different when a microphone and camera are involved. Also, as hosts, we can get caught up in what we need to make a successful episode, like making sure we hit the record button before we start. Those communication skills can take a back seat if we're caught up in those kinds of things, but don't let that happen. As I talked about earlier, your preparation will help you decide what topics and questions you'll discuss, but be flexible. Make sure that as your guest is talking, you are actively listening. Listening as a podcast host means you listen to the words and you watch for what isn't being said. Look for cues that the current topic is worth exploring more. Does the guest lean forward as she talks? Does her voice tone change? Does she seem more passionate or animated about the subject? These are all cues that you should explore this topic a little bit more and maybe even pivot away from what you had planned to talk about. Now, the reverse can also be true. Watch for any cues that the guest is uncomfortable with the topic. Is she responding with short answers? Is she crossing her arms? Is she trying to bring another topic into the conversation? It seems like she wants to move on. Respect that and follow her lead. Another aspect of active listening is knowing when and when not to talk as the host. Have you ever been listening to a podcast episode and really getting into the guest story when the host interrupts and starts sharing their own experiences? This is so annoying and frustrating. Remember that your guest is with you to tell their story. Interjecting your related experience should only be done with caution. If your experience adds to the conversation, then great, go ahead. What you want to say may even contribute to the guest sharing more about what they offer or share, and then that's a great reason to go ahead and do that. A better technique is to include your listeners in the conversation. At the appropriate time, you can do this by saying something like, "I know a lot of our listeners today can relate to that experience. What advice would you give them?" Or something along those lines. This gives the guest a chance to elaborate and offer even more value to your audience. The last thing I want to share about communication relates to silence. Whether we are talking to a podcast guest or a person in real life, we may get uncomfortable with silence, but silence is golden, as they say. As you listen to your guest speak, listen for opportunities to let what they said sink in. A few seconds of silence will allow the listeners to pause and consider what was said. Don't be afraid to let this happen as you're recording. I can't tell you how many times that I've gone back to edit an episode and I realized I missed the opportunity to let something that the guest said really sit with the audience. I may go back to it later in the conversation, but it doesn't have the same effect. And speaking of going back to another topic during a conversation, there may be times when it is appropriate. So don't be afraid to do this during the recording. I like to take notes, as I've mentioned, while my guest is talking about points that I believe the audience would want to know more about. So some guests have a, shall we say, speaking style that makes it difficult to break in and ask a question. So I may need to wait for a natural pause. Just make sure they're able to finish the current thought or topic before you go back to the previous point, so it doesn't look like you're interrupting. So those are your 3 keys to connecting with your guest: preparation, allowing buffer time, and strong communication skills. But before I close today, I want to point out something else. You may have noticed as I spoke about these 3 key points, I mentioned the listeners with each one. After all, if you have no listeners, you have no podcast. Keeping the listeners front of mind as you prepare for and talk with your guest is what I would call a bonus key to creating great interviews and connections. In fact, when I consciously started keeping the listeners front of mind, I started getting the positive comments I talked about earlier. If you need a little help with this, try creating an avatar of your ideal podcast listener. You know the process. Where do they hang out? What do they look like? What do they do for a living? What do they do for fun? Mine is named Claire, just in case you were wondering. Keep this person in mind as you prepare and participate in each interview. It really does help. Also, reminding your guest that the goal of your podcast is to serve the listeners. That will put the focus where it needs to be, offering value and inspiration to those who are listening. When you and your guest align as a connected team, you'll create conversations that resonate deeply and keep them coming back for more. I'm Kim Benoit, and I want to thank you so much for spending time with me today. Happy podcasting and connecting.